Welcome to the Neurofaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Curt Thompson, and we are here to explore what it means to live at the intersection of emerging scientific discoveries about the mind and following and being formed by Jesus, and how that can lead us into a world of greater human flourishing. We are eager to hear from our guests not only about the work they are doing, but how it speaks to what it means for us to thrive in our present particular moment. My guest today on the Neurofaith Podcast is Sarah Schnitker. Dr. Schnitker is Associate Professor of Psychology at Baylor University, whose area of work is in the study of virtue and character development in adolescents and emerging adults, with a focus on the role of spirituality and religion in the development and formation of virtue. Moreover, she has a particular interest in the study of the virtue of patience. She holds a doctorate in personality and social psychology from UC Davis. Dr. Schnitker, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be with you today.
Today in our world, we find ourselves in a space that it's easy for any of us who are living and are awake in this world to look around and think, goodness, we couldn't use, there wouldn't be a better time for us to need, more understanding about how we develop character. And I'm just so curious and intrigued and would love for our audience to hear how you arrived at this place. And so with that in mind, please tell us a little bit about your story and how you came to find the work that you're doing to be so exciting.
Every day, I think I come across something where yep, the work I do is really important. We need to figure out how to do this better. And we see some great exemplars of people who have wonderful character that excite me and encourage me, but I also encounter some real failures in the media and day-to-day life. So I think some of my story, right, how did I come to be a virtues researcher, character researcher? I didn't even know, probably most people are like, I didn't know that was a thing. And thinking back to my own adolescence, I was obvious, as many of my colleagues who are professors, right? Big nerd. But I loved math and science and the methodology, but I also really loved kind of these perennial questions of philosophy and religion, and thinking about what is flourishing? How do we help people, and not just people, but societies and groups and communities to flourish? And was very excited when my freshman year of college, working with Dr. Peter Hill, who was at Grove City at the time, learned it's really cool. You can do this science that brings the scientific method to studying these questions of how do we cultivate virtues in people, and does that matter for flourishing, and how so, and does religion promote flourishing, and also how does it undermine it? And it was just a perfect fit for me because I like data. I like to say, okay, I work with many philosophers, but I'm like, okay, this is what we think is happening. And here's our thought experiments of people sitting in rooms by themselves doing these things. But what happens in the real world? And what happens in particular communities and contexts, that it's not just about the individual. It's not just about my character as a unique person, but all of us are embedded in these cultural contexts and these developmental contexts. And what can the person control, but what also can't they control? And how do we have to think about that holistically? But it provides a lot of purpose for me.
Well, in particular, your work has focused on our religious expression and experience and the formation of character and virtue. And would love to hear you share with our audience, what are some things that you have learned, that you are learning about the role that our religious experience plays in the formation of character and the emergence of virtue?
I would say at a very broad level, we find that religious engagement different aspects of spirituality, I would say they have this magnifying effect and there's a whole literature out there on this idea of psychological sanctification. So now for those who are theologians, there's a very theological definition or kind of definition of what sanctification means kind of from different theological traditions. But what we're talking about psychologically is this idea that people imbue things with sacred meaning. And that religion...
I'm going to interrupt you for a second.
Yep.
Give us an example.
Yes. So a classic example here is parenting. That this can just be a mundane activity, or someone can say, my parenting has sacred and spiritual significance. For someone who's traditionally religious, that could be that this is a God-given ordained role that is special, that is set apart from other types of activities I do. And what you find, and people also do this very commonly with marriage. Christianity, this is in some Christian traditions, is a really set apart, it's a sacred thing. And so what happens when people, but you can do this really with anything. My work can be imbued with sacred calling kind of ideas. And so what you find, and this is some of the literature by Ken Pargament, Annette Mahoney, and many others, and we've looked at this in some of my own work as well. When you add the sacred meaning, it makes it so that people experience more well-being when things are going well with things that are sanctified, that it magnifies the effect. But the other downside is when things don't go well, when the marriage fails, or when your child is really struggling, if you've sanctified your parenting, it could have an exaggerated effect on your well-being, that you actually have more sense of loss, greater decrements to sense of self, things like that. And so I would say that's a very kind of specific internal process. But what the literature starts to show is that this kind of works at a greater level, that religion has this really amazing, potent power to bring out the best in us and to help these amazing character traits develop in these exemplars. Oftentimes people hear like, wow, the Mother Teresa's of the world, right. You're like, who sacrifices this way? But you also see that it leads to some of the biggest instantiations of vice, that religion leads to some of our greatest acts of violence, and gives people excuses sometimes to do things that are really horrible, and abuse scandals and things of that sort. So
you used the phrase psychological sanctification. I am guessing that many in our audience, perhaps may not have heard those two words put together in the same way. And I would love for you, because I'm guessing that not just as a researcher, but there are some practical implications for us in paying attention to this. I would love for you to talk about what you mean by that and to give us some sense of how, when you're talking about that, how does that separate itself in helpful ways from the theological narrative of sanctification that we usually talk about?
Mm-hmm. So what I'm really talking about here is a psychological process. So I can give a very practical example. So if we're thinking about virtue development, one of the things, so let's say we're going to think about how do I develop more gratitude in my life? There are many studies now showing that kind of a daily practice of gratitude or a weekly practice where you journal or really take time to reflect on the things for which you're grateful, that not only increases your gratitude, it might also help you be more pro-social. It also makes you typically happier and maybe even healthier sometimes. Like there's all these benefits for the self and others. In one study I did with a former student, Kelsey Richardson, we said, okay, if you're practicing that gratitude just as a psychological exercise for the sake of well-being and just becoming a better person, how might that look a little bit different than if we say, this is actually a prayer practice that makes you closer to God? So it's the same activity of listing down the things you're thankful for. But when it's framed as prayer, it's imbued with this sacred significance that this is no longer just something I'm doing. And what we found there is that when it was practiced as prayer, it had more potent effects. So that's what I'm talking about with sanctification.
So you might say more potent effects measured how?
In how much gratitude they actually developed across 6 weeks, how it affected their emotions. So they had a greater increase in positive emotions. We didn't find an effect in that study for health symptomatology, so it wasn't like they were healthier in the prayer group, but those are some of the examples. But let me give you another example on the downside. So in another study that I conducted, also with some former students, Tyler Greenway and Abigail Shepard, we did a similar thing, and we were looking at, okay, let's use this kind of same paradigm where we are imbuing something with sacred meaning by having it be practiced as prayer. And in that study, we told people about an international crisis situation and had participants either pray for that crisis, people who are in that crisis, or think about people who are in that crisis and kind of process it, ask questions about it, really just reflect on it over the course of several weeks. And then at the end, we asked them a variety of measures, but like what we're most interested in is how does their generosity change after thinking about an international crisis situation? And we originally hypothesized that when they sanctify through prayer, we actually thought they'll give more. We gave them the opportunity to donate their $20 payment for being in the study to that crisis situation. We actually found the opposite there, that people who were in the prayer condition gave less, which was a bit alarming. But what we think happened there is that the people who prayed felt psychologically that I've already done something. I've taken action. These were all people who regularly attended church and Christian participants. So it kind of alleviated that psychological pressure to take action to address the crisis, because for them, they indeed had taken action. They'd asked God to help them. But I think for many religious practitioners, religious leaders, religious people themselves, they'd say, that's not great. We want people not only to pray, but also to do something. So that kind of study says there's implications for how we talk about prayer in religious communities. Maybe we need to remind people, yes, praying is action, but so is actually taking action. And whether in Christian communities or other religious traditions, there's many sacred scriptures talking about don't just tell people don't just pray, like your actions matter too. So that's kind of that other side that we really need to be careful of.
Right. Well, you're describing something that leads me to, I'm going to conflate two questions that I have. One is around a question of flourishing. Like what is in your mind, in the research that you're doing, what does flourishing look like? And that might be a combination of character and virtue formation and deepening. But I'm also I'm what does that look like? But I'm also struck by your this description that you gave about this research project. And I know that in my own personal experience, and when we talk about prayer, particularly in North America, we're often, when people think about this, you think like, oh, I, Curt, am now going to embark upon praying for this thing. And my wife Phyllis will pray, and my friend Byron will pray, and so forth and so on. But we're all kind of doing this as individuals. And I can go pray, But that would be very different than me gathering in our church, and at the end of the church service, we have a sense in which we together are going to take up a collection or do something about this impoverished group of people that each of us as individuals has been praying about. But now together we're going to do something. And so this raises this question for me about what your work does to show us how this character development and flourishing is shaped not just by the things that we do as individuals, but shaped by our interaction with community. And how does that make a difference for us?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that, because this is it's a great question, and I think we're working on a corrective. I think in our society. So, right, there's two parts there, and they really do go together. So I'm glad you put them together. So when I think about flourishing, and I've thought about this a lot with a former colleague at Fuller Seminary, Pamela Epstein-King, also with former colleague who's now at the Search Institute, Ben Holtberg. When we were all working together previously, we really spent a lot of time talking about flourishing and really thinking it as a fit of the person and their context. And that flourishing is not just an individual level variable. It's not just my own virtue, my own happiness, my own living out of my purpose. It is those things, but it also is, am I matching with my community? And am I contributing to the bigger group? And that even if I'm happy, but my group and my community is not doing well, we're not really flourishing, that this needs to be considered at multiple levels. And that it's myself in this interaction, this dynamic engagement with my community. And that if both aren't flourishing, we've got a problem. And right, if I'm flourishing at the expense of my broader community, that's a real problem, which makes us think as psychologists, and my training's in social psychology, so in personality, and also a bit of developmental, and really trying to think about our methodology. How do we think about not just the individual, but also their context? And so when you're part of your question of then the second part, right, what does it mean to pray by yourself versus actually with a group? I think that is something we are exploring. So some studies we've done, so like the studies I described to you were very individual based. And this is a trade-off I make in different studies. And other studies, though, so the beauty of that kind of study is it's very clean. I can randomly assign people to conditions. I can get a little bit more at causality. But then other studies we do in my lab, we do more out in the field. So, for example, I've done studies with adolescents who are training with a group called Team World Vision. And these are adolescents who are training for half or full marathons to raise money for safe water efforts in African countries. And looking at across those 6 months of training in these really neat, cohesive teams, what happens? And how does engagement with the team affect their self-control and patience development? And how do their ways they change affect development? Or several years ago, we looked at adolescents attending Young Life camps. So these are religious summer camps that they go together as a group and have these team dynamics, and what happens at those camps and what happens in the year following, and how do people, what's leading them to change, and how does engagement with that social group matter? So with our research program, kind of in psychoreligion, there's this constant back and forth of, okay, what are the contextual factors? And using this more longitudinal, in context, in situ methodology, and these more experimental paradigms to try to build up our knowledge. And honestly, I'd say this is a growth area for our field. And we're really working on that right now.
Right. And so if I'm hearing you right, I'm hearing you say that thus far, even as you are, plowing a new furrow in some respects, this growth edge in the research domain of this work, that there is there's important data already that would be necessary to pay attention to. If you, Dr. Schnitker, were talking to a pastor or a group of pastors, and they're saying, gosh, we really want to cultivate greater character and virtue in our community. We want to be able to do this well. And of course, each of them thinking I've got this collection of individuals, which is kind of how we're kind of primed to think, as opposed to, or even as opposed to a rhythm between individuals that are made up of individuals that are part of that community, this back and forth rhythm that we live with. I would really be curious to say, to know if you were going to give them, your top things for them to be paying attention to. What might those things be that your research is telling us?
Yeah, and I think I like to break it down into like a how and why. So I think you need to think about how we build virtues. And here I'm talking about like specific practices and activities. That virtues and character strengths, it needs to be tangible habits. It's not just big picture, highfalutin reflection. You don't will yourself into being a good person, you practice it. Right? So it's that daily practice of gratitude. It's learning, how do I be patient? How do I regulate my emotions? What are emotions? How do I identify them? How do I learn to think about them differently? That helps me be patient. So,
and necessarily, I realize I'm interrupting you here. Necessarily, that would require us. So when we say things like, well, practice gratitude, you're like, okay, I'm going to go do that. No, you would say like, no, I want you to get a journal.
Yeah,
and I want
exactly.
you to
very specific.
Write this down. If I'm going to practice patience, I'm gonna like, in my journal also, like I can have a page for my gratitude and a page for my patience. I'm going to list the times today when my patience was tried and explore that. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're really talking about measurable, embodied practices that we need to actually boots on the ground put into play if these kinds of things are going to take place.
Exactly. Thank you. That is exactly it. And I think, and there's some that maybe have been in religious traditions that have gone out of vogue, but might be worth reviving.
Mm-hmm. Such as?
So like, for example, fasting.
Right.
Especially in a lot of Christian traditions in America, I don't know that that's super common. But that's a great one. It builds self-control. We know there's a lot of literature in psychology.
And, you tell people, my goodness, if I had, my evening meal last night, I would be done with my evening meal and I wouldn't think about food at all because I would know that breakfast is coming and then lunch and so forth the next day. But if I knew I was going to be fasting the next day, I'd finish my evening meal and like already by 7 o'clock, all I would be thinking about is like why I'm not like that. I'm not going to be able to and my impulse to want to hoard and so forth. So you're right. I mean, it reveals.
And it's interesting. I mean, it's really cool. So, and that one's on my mind. So a lot of my research looks at Christian populations, but in the last year, I've got several postdoctoral scholars in my lab who are Muslim. And, I love to engage across religions because we can learn things from each other. And in the Muslim faith, kind of around the world and in the US too, like fasting is a huge tradition that they have the whole month of Ramadan that is practiced. And so we did this really fun for me, maybe not for the people fasting, where we tracked adolescents who were fasting during Ramadan and did this experience sampling methodology and looked at like throughout the day as they are not eating or drinking, how did it affect their patience and self-control and their gratitude and what were their religious practices? So we're analyzing those data right now. But I think those are the kind of things that I think we could reclaim from our even from the Christian tradition, but doing that together, though. So that's a great example of, okay, you can try to do that by yourself. It's really hard. But when you have a special prayer you're going to do with your community, when you break the fast and you know the person next to you is also doing it, and you can encourage each other and know that for like with Ramadan and Islam or Lent, some people do really fast for Lent in the Christian faith, like know that all of the people in my religious community around the world are trying to do this right now with me. That provides, that scaffolds from this practice, this very specific how, to a bigger picture why. Why does this practice matter? Why do we care? What is this ultimate telos? To use a very big fancy word. What is our purpose in relation to the divine, in relation to this life, to humanity? And I think that's where religions in particular have this leg up from other communities in terms of taking this how, these practices for building virtue. Anyone can do those. But religion is really potent because it also provides a very explicit of why they matter and ultimate meaning for human beings. These huge existential questions, these ultimate concerns of purpose. And religion deals with those in really comprehensive ways. And so it's one community where you're doing these practices together, but also talking about those big why questions. And that's really cool.
Yeah, it really is. So I imagine, we like to say in our business that no two siblings ever grow up in the same house.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have, different children come into the world with different temperaments, and temperaments and attachment combinations have this effect of shaping, the development of who they are and personality and so forth and so on. I'm wondering a couple of things. I'm wondering to what degree, for those in our listening audience who are parents and who are wondering, gosh, I want to apply these things. I'm hearing Dr. Schnitker talk about these things. These things are encouraging and so forth. And I have 3 kids, and 1 or 2 of my kids would be really so interested in these kinds of things. And one of them, is going to have a very different response to me about these kinds of things. What can you tell us that your work informs you of regarding not just how these virtues both reveal personality, but how much does virtue training and character development even shape personality, given that we're going to have these different forms of little things we call children that are growing up in our homes?
Yep. That's a fantastic question. Of course, it's extremely complicated what the data say to us. You find there are quite a few studies looking at kind of personality and religiousness. And it goes both ways. So some studies show that people with certain personalities are drawn to religion and become more religious across time. People who are more conscientious, more agreeable, they seem more attracted to religion. And we see this through longitudinal studies. But we also find that people, as they participate more in religion, they also become more conscientious and agreeable, more virtuous. So it's really this reciprocal dynamic. So both are operating. But I think something that is really important to remember is, so I like when I talk to parents and when I talk to myself as a parent, I'm also telling myself, yes, this person, there are a lot of things you can't control. This person has a genetic predisposition that's interacted with their environment and the unique environment in that family. But I think sometimes we have a sense of what the ideal spirituality is or what the ideal person is. And I think something beautiful with virtues is a community needs people to have diverse strengths. And I like to think about, and this is where that communal perspective really helps, of no person is perfectly virtuous. And no person can have everything be a strength for them. So this is where I'm like, that's why I like to look at the virtue of the whole community. So maybe I struggle with gratitude in my marriage, but my husband is great at it. And so as a couple, when we function as a couple, we're actually doing fabulous in it, because I then do really great on the self-control piece, and maybe he struggles. So you aren't alone. It's not your job as an individual to perfect all the virtues. And so as we think about our children developing, yes, we want to really make sure there's not major weaknesses or major vices, but it's also thinking about how they fit into a community, and saying, you know what, we can capitalize on the strengths they do have and know that they'll play a role in their faith community or in the broader society, and allow for that individuality to emerge in kind of how they develop. So that's one piece I say. Another thing I would say is that sometimes just exposure does matter. So I mentioned earlier some of these Young Life studies we did. So these are really cool. We measured adolescents before they went to these Young Life summer camps. And if you're not aware of the organization, these camps are a ton of fun. They create this amazing experience. They have a lot of fun activities. They have amazing food. They have religious sermons and messages. They have small group time. They build relationships. And we wanted to look at so we measure them before they go to camp, before they have this experience, immediately after camp. And there we ask them, did you recommit your life to God or commit your life to God for the first time at camp, which is the language of that culture to talk about kind of a spiritual transformation happening. And then we followed them up a year later. And we wanted to see how spiritual conversion, transformation, change across time affected their virtues and how they engaged other people. Their personal well-being. So did I become happier, less depressed, etc., across time? And then also their meaning, purpose in life. So we called it their epistemic functioning, but really how they were doing with meaning in life. And it's interesting. So you really need that internalization, sustained religious and spirituality of that faith message to grow in virtue. But you didn't need that as much to predict. The best predictor of just that general well-being and happiness and lower mental illness symptoms a year later, it was actually that experience right after camp, the recommitment people felt or commitment to God. So how really that camp experience itself. Whereas what was the best predictor of that meaning and purpose a year later was just their continued Young Life participation over the years. So just that regular weekly exposure to the messaging. So it was interesting there that some things, the more virtue development, really did require that internalization of the religion and spirituality. But for others, it was that mountaintop experience. And then for those, it's just showing up at Young Life camp, or Young Life weekly meetings, whether or not you actually really internalized it. It was just hearing it week after week provided the purpose.
Right.
So that's cool.
So again, I mean, in some respects, it gives us that picture that you were talking about earlier of how virtue is not just a thing that individuals take in and embeds individuals. It is something that embeds a community. And like in families, this community is now made up of different groups of people who are experiencing their transformation, if I can use that word, experiencing their transformation in different ways over time. And, I again, we we talk with parents frequently about, parents who wonder and sometimes often worry about the long range outcome of their children's spiritual formation. And especially if they see early evidence that one child moves in one direction and another child moves in another direction. And of course, the parents only know of the experience that they've had, and it's just been one parenting model that they've, imbued into their kids. And so it's easy for them to ask the question, well, what did we do wrong, or what are we not doing enough of here? And it may also be important for parents to hear, well, gosh, if you have 3 kids, you've got maybe 3 different ways in which they are going to be deeply and durably formed, in which they don't all follow the same pathway, but they are all perhaps in line for having a similar long-term experience. It just depends upon the way that their combination of temperament and attachment processes are creating space for them to live into that. Am I hearing that right?
Yep, exactly. And the other thing I would just add is, especially once they become adolescents, research suggests those relationships with other adults in their life beyond the parent really matter too. And I often encourage parents, there's this sometimes, this differentiation that adolescents want to have from their parents. And so one of the best things you can sometimes do is also provide access to other adults who are trustworthy and safe. And it might be a lot easier for your adolescent to work through their doubts with this trusted other adult than with you, right? They might feel like, oh, it's going to threaten my relationship if I doubt what my parents say, but they need a safe space to do that. And so that's why try to find a variety of adults who are willing to invest in your teen. And have those kind of conversations, because it might be better to happen with them. And then also, I encourage all the adults out there, are you willing to do that for other youth in your community? And viewing this as parenting, raising children as a communal activity, not an individual parent activity. The other shout out I would give is to grandparents. There's research showing that they even might have a more potent effect on spiritual development than parents. There's something special about that relationship.
So not just the message that would be good for grandparents to hear about their place, but also the message that it would be for parents to hear about allowing their children to have under those conditions that it makes sense for them to have as much contact with their grandparents as they can, and to give those grandparents an opportunity to do the work that they are built to do.
Mm-hmm.
You have mentioned this a couple of times. Because you have done particular work with this virtue of patience. I think about the pandemic world in which we live, and I think about the waiting that many people are having to put into practice, the patience that we are having to practice, especially as we find ourselves in this particular moment in our history. I would love to hear you speak a word about what any of your work about patience says, what has stood out to you about that, and what you would want us to hear about that.
Mm-hmm. I think the last couple of years have truly shown how important it is, and maybe shown us that we've not prepared ourselves well for practicing patience. I think patience, it's interesting to look at different faith traditions. Patience is something that I think in American Christianity in particular, people have actually abandoned it a bit as a virtue. And I think it's time for us to reclaim it. In contrast to my Muslim colleagues, for whom in Islam it's practiced in many places, patience is like the virtue that's talked about all the time. And so I think in Christian culture in the U.S., which is the predominant religion, right, thinking about if we have to suffer and wait, that is not a technological failure. That is the reality of the world.
That's right, to live in the world.
And that we have a lot of resources in our sacred text and in our faith tradition with things like fasting that we need to revive. And that patience is a good thing. All the literature thus far says that cultivating patience is possible, that it is not passivity. I think a lot of our US culture says if you're patient, that means you're not trying hard enough. That it's actually the opposite, that we have studies showing that people who are patient actually exert more effort in the pursuit of their goals, that patience is really this beautiful middle point of not becoming reckless and overly emotionally engaged, but it's allowing to stick with it so that you don't give up, right? Patience is not disengagement. It is not passivity. It is willing to suffer and stick with something without being unduly disrupted. So that you can love other people, so that you can work for justice, so that you can work towards these ultimate goals that are so important for virtue, that you can't love without patience and you can't pursue justice without patience. And we need to really be cultivating that.
Wow. So rich, so good. If people who are listening to this would like to learn more about the kind of work that you're doing, is there a way for them to access that? Is there a way for them to be curious about that? Where would you, in what direction would you point people? And should any of our listeners who are in the academy who have interest in connecting with you, what would be the best way for them to do that? Or anyone for that matter?
I would say my lab, the Science of Virtues Lab at Baylor University, we have a website. If you Google my name, Sarah Schnitker, Science of Virtues Lab, that should pop right up. Any researchers, feel free to just email me. My email is out there, Sarah_Schnitker at Baylor.edu. I'd also say, there's some great resources out there around this topic. You can find some that I've done. I think the Thrive Center for Human Development at Fuller Seminary has also, I've done some work with them when I was previously there. They have some awesome, more lay accessible resources. The Search Institute, my colleague Ben Holtberg is the CEO there. They have some wonderful resources that I think can be used across contexts. So we talk about the power of religion, but traditional religion is not the only way we can grow spiritually. And that there are ways to think about spirituality in pluralistic contexts and when you have diverse beliefs in a group. And so Search does a great job of curating those. And I'm just so excited that more and more people are talking about this topic and wanting to grow together in this area.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Indeed. To our audience, you have been listening to the Neurofaith Podcast. I'm Dr. Curt Thompson, your host. My guest today has been Dr. Sarah Schnitker, Associate Professor of Psychology at Baylor University. Thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, this is the Neurofaith Podcast.